Hello, everyone. I think we're ready to go ahead and get started. Welcome to the 2023 South Asia Book Award Meet the Author webinar series. This series of 3 webinars features the award-winning books for the 2023 South Asia Book Awards in the young adult, middle grade, and young reader categories. My name is Andrea Fowler. I'm the Assistant Director at the Center for South Asia at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. My colleague, Essie Lenchner, Assistant Director of the Institute for Regional and International Studies National Resource Center, she and I together serve as co-administrators for the Book Award. The South Asia Book Award, or SABA, is supported by the South Asia National Outreach Consortium and is given annually for up to 3 outstanding works of literature, which accurately and skillfully portray the experience of individuals living in South Asia or of South Asians living in other parts of the world. Honor books and highly commended books will also be recognized by the committee for their contribution to this body of literature on the region. A complete list of all recognized titles going back to our first award year in 2010 is available on our website, southasiabookaward.wisc.edu. Today's webinar will include approximately 30 to 40 minutes of author presentation and reading, followed by a Q&A. Please note that since we are using a webinar for today's event, the chat is disabled. Please add your comments and questions to the Q&A box throughout today's event. After the presentation and reading, we'll get through as many of your questions as we can. And it is our pleasure this afternoon to welcome the 2023 SABA Award winner in the Young Adult category, Durre Aziz Amna. Durre Aziz Amna is from Rawalpindi, Pakistan, and now lives in Newark, New Jersey. Her work has appeared in the New York Times, the Financial Times, and Al Jazeera, among others. She was selected as Forbes 30 Under 30 in 2022 and won the 2019 Financial Times Bodley Head Essay Prize. She is a graduate of Yale and the Helen Zell Writers Program at the University of Michigan. Her debut novel, American Fever, won the 2023 Asian Pacific American Award for Literature just before it won the 2023 SABA Award in the Young Adult category. Please help me welcome Durre. Thank you for being here.
Thank you so much for that kind introduction, Andrea, and thank you so much to SABA, to the University of Wisconsin, to Essie and Andrea for organizing this. It's such an honor to win this award, but also to be here and to give a short presentation on this novel, and to ask, to answer any questions that people might have at the end. So before I start, I'm going to try to I'm going to do a short presentation, and I'm trying to see if I can share the screen. Okay, perfect. So I wanted to just start off with a quick introduction of the book, which is my debut novel. It published last August in the US, the UK, and elsewhere. And I thought that I would start off, given that this is the South Asia Book Award, by just sort of giving a background of how the book came about, by way of a background of myself as a writer. So I was born and raised in Rawalpindi, Pakistan, and when I was in high school, I had this experience I had the opportunity to come to the US for an exchange year. 1 second, I'm just making sure. Okay, I was just okay. 1 second, how does this go back? Okay. So I had this this opportunity to come to the US for an exchange year, which took me to rural Oregon for a year. It was an exchange program funded by the United States Department of State. So I got this chance to live in rural Oregon, which, as anyone can imagine, was extremely different from my upbringing in this quite large, by most standards, South Asian city, Rawalpindi, where I'm from. And then after that, I went back to Pakistan and moved here eventually for college. And since then, I've been in the US. And so, partly that's to explain sort of like my connection to South Asia. I write extensively about Pakistan in various formats, both journalism, essays, personal essays that sort of delve into languages of South Asia, the culture, and also in my fiction. And secondly, because the book very fundamentally was affected by my upbringing, because the book has several autobiographical elements to it. So it starts off very much with my own story of being a high school student in Pakistan and coming to the US for an exchange program. A lot of the details of the book and a lot of the characters that she meets and a lot of the plot deviates from what actually happened in my life, but sort of like the seed for a lot of those things was in there. And I thought that as part of this presentation, I'll also do a short reading and just to give people a flavor of the book. And I think that typically when I do a reading from the book, I do the very opening, because in my experience, it's very hard to do readings from novels that, because obviously most readers don't have the full context for the entire book. But since this is an award that is, and a lot of this webinar is also particularly geared towards educators who might be looking for at this book as a potential reading list entry for high schoolers. So I figured that I would actually do a very short passage that starts off in the high school that my character Hira, who is 16 years old, she has just moved to the US, to rural Oregon, for high school, with the high school that she attends. So this is her very first day of high school. And I think I'll make it somewhat short. Okay. My first class was English Lit, with Amy and the rest of the juniors. The two other exchange students, a boy from Oman and a girl from France, had opted for sophomore English, but Kelly had called ahead about my placement. She has to be in the same class as Amy, she told the superintendent. Her English is so good, you will be amazed. My first 2 weeks in Oregon, I struggled to express myself, telling Ammi over the phone that living in English felt like wearing shadi ke kapde to bed. Kelly, however, interrupted me often. Kelly is the host mother. Kelly, however, interrupted me often to marvel at my sentences, asking me what that word I had just used meant and how I had learned such good English. I detailed for her the length of British rule in the subcontinent, but felt irritated at the lowliness of her expectations. I was used to my parents with their painfully high standards, who, when they called to tell me my O-level grades had come back all A's, sounded happy but unsurprised. I didn't want to be patted on the back for knowing what fecundity meant. Since then, I have developed other theories for why certain foreigners get offended at being complimented on their English. Objectively a pleasant appraisal, and a reasonable one given that many people in their home countries do not speak the language at all. Raised in places standing in the long imperial shadow of English, we are taught to peg our worth to how well we know the language. I had grown up reading only in English, respecting teachers more when they instructed in English, envying Dawn TV anchors when they delivered the news in clipped English. I claim the language dearly, and it made me angry that someone could question my right to it, even in compliment. In class, I rifled through the heavy textbook, worried. Poe, Thoreau, Arthur Miller, I had never heard these names. My literary world had consisted of Dickens and the Brontes, Blyton and Austen, books set in the English countryside, pubs and boarding schools. That, by the way, is a clear sign of class. If you were reading Blyton in 90s Pakistan, you were undoubtedly the bourgeoisie. The only American I had read was Nathaniel Hawthorne, and that too because the Scarlet Letter was part of a gender studies course Ammi half-heartedly took once. She stopped attending the evening classes after a week, citing exhaustion from her day job. I, on the other hand, remained enrolled, sneaking the readings upstairs at night, learning by age 12 about female genital mutilation in African countries and the misogynistic machinations of the burqa, becoming a gullible convert to Western feminism at a tender age. My worry, however, subsided soon after class began. The teacher, a lean man with a graying mustache, asked the students what they remembered of Emerson from sophomore year. Such silence ensued that I could hear the superintendent scold a student in the hallway. Mr. Avery resumed talking after a brief pause. He seemed to have expected the silence. He gave a short summary of Emerson's life and then said, "Samantha, why don't you read out the first paragraph of Self-Reliance for us?" Samantha sighed and began to recite Emerson in the dull register of the condemned. "A little louder," said Mr. Avery cheerfully, annoying me. Why wasn't he telling Samantha she was eating half her words and sounded like an idiot? After she finished her paragraph, Mr. Avery looked around and asked, "Who wants to read next?" I raised my hand out of habit. We clamored to get selected for recitations back home, before realizing that I was the only one who had. Everyone stared. Even the teacher looked with suspicion at my lone hand, suspended limply in the air. Amy avoided my gaze in the next two classes. I had never been the most popular girl in school, but I was sufficiently liked. Back home, there was considerable cachet to being a good student, and that I'd always been. Things seemed to work differently in Lakeview, where students spent much of their energy vying to appear disinterested in class, in a race for the most authentic brand of Enua. Okay, so I think I'll stop there. That's a passage sort of, towards the maybe the 25-30% mark of the book. So it might be a little hard to contextualize, but yeah, to sort of summarize again, she has just moved, Hira, the main character, has just moved to Oregon, where she's attending a very, very small high school in a rural setting. And she's being hosted by Kelly, who is her host mother, and Amy, who is her host sister. I thought that I would also sort of talk about the literary influences particular to this book, because of course, I've, as the passage also sort of talked about, there's a lot of stuff that I had been reading prior to coming to the US, and that of course everything shapes what you write about, but that sort of does it at a slant. Here I'm talking specifically about the books that were fundamental or important in writing this particular book. So I think that ever since I've come to the US, I've been interested in writers who've written about that experience of immigrating, particularly to the US, and particularly also South Asians, because obviously that is relatable at a different level for me. So I look up to writers like Jhumpa Lahiri, who've written a lot about that cultural disconnect and the movement between one culture to another, and how you bring or cannot bring that previous place with you, and what that struggle to bring it along looks like. And then in a similar vein, another book that was very important was Colm Toybeen's Brooklyn, which is about an Irish woman who moves to the US, to Brooklyn, in I believe it's the late 50s or 60s. And one of the reasons that book really spoke to me was that because when I picked it up, I didn't pick it up as a book that would, have a lot in common with what I was writing about, because it was an Irish woman. It's set a good 60 years before American Fever is, which by the way is set around 2010, 2011. But what amazed me was just how much that book spoke to me, and how much it did seem to have in common with American Fever. And it sort of gave me a lot of hope, really, because here I was writing American Fever thinking that it was a very specific story, and in some ways it is, but also it is also what Colm Toybeen's book told me was that it was also in a lot of ways very, very universal, and this sort of mass migration and mass movement has been the story of our world for, a century or more. And so American Fever was also, while hopefully being specific, it was also part of this larger literary tradition around the world. And then in terms of nonfiction, I've been influenced a lot by work such as those by the Japanese writer Minami Mizumura, who has written extensively about the English language and how it sort of has come to threaten a lot of other languages and cultures around the world, and what that threat looks like, and how do we make sure that other languages continue to exist and thrive alongside this what sometimes feels like impossible to stop imposition of English. So the themes of the book, I just sort of like really just listed these out in sort of, and this is where I'm like sort of thinking about how this book might resonate with, I know that a lot, as I said, a lot of the people who might be attending this webinar are thinking of this book as a potential book to put in front of their students. And so a big part of the book is obviously it's a coming of age story. That's what I set out to do at the beginning. That's what the initial vision for the book looked like, that it was about a young girl who is sort of learning the ways of the world, which is at the very heart of any coming of age story. And she's at that exact age that a lot of coming of age stories are set, which is late adolescence. She's 16 at the beginning of the novel and 17 at the end. It's set in a very short, distinct time period. So it's like the 1 year that the exchange program takes place in. But obviously I started off with that, but because she was moving countries, she was coming from Pakistan to the US. There are all these other themes that were brought into the book. The main one being movement from one country and culture to another. And then cultural assimilation, how she comes to the US, and particularly because she is in a part of the country where there is no choice but to assimilate, because obviously it's a very, very small rural place, and how she sort of resists that, sometimes sometimes in a way that is foolish and sometimes in a way that could be admirable to someone. And then one major thing is this question of language and multilingualism. A lot of the book is sort of like ruminations on this question that I referred to earlier too, of how do we, especially when you move to a place where English is the lingua franca, or even generally, how do you, because a lot of the story is also about Hira, how she's been in Pakistan itself, which is a post-colonial state. English does have a particular power and hold in all official businesses, in all sort of corridors of power, at the best educational institutions. And how do we interrogate that? Do we sort of just accept that and move on? Is there any point in resisting that? Another very, very important theme is family, because she's at this stage where she is starting to become her own person, but is also realizing that in a lot of ways she still wants the warmth of that family that she left behind. She is suddenly away from both her parents, and is trying to keep in touch with them and it's so funny, because I think maybe if this book had been, I don't know if the book would probably have to change tremendously if it was set today, where there is much more ease of communication. But at the time that it is set, it's really possible for her mostly to talk over the phone, or sometimes through emails, but there isn't any of that like constant communication that would be the case today. And then another thing that I was very interested in exploring was the idea of class. So Hira is comfortably situated back home. She's not rich per se, but she lives in a city. She compared to most of the people that most of her countrymen, she is better off. And then suddenly she is moved to this place in the hinterlands of the United States that is rural and impoverished. And I was interested in this juxtaposition, partly because there's this idea that, of course, like most immigrants, most economic migrants to the US are leaving behind these places of destitution and poverty, and of course, like all refugees too, and they're coming to this land of opportunity where there's boundless opportunity, boundless wealth. But I wanted to sort of flip that on its head, and also just show this part of the country that I myself got to be acquainted with during my own exchange year that informed a lot of the book, which was this extremely rural town where a lot of people were on government support. Very few people had health insurance. So their experiences with class were just tremendously different from Hira's. And then finally, I think I was, as someone who thinks a lot and deeply about the US and the place that it occupies in the world. It's very sort of like imperial posture that it has towards the rest of the world. It was important for me to also, and it's fiction, and it's told from the perspective of a 16-year-old. So it's sometimes she sort of stumbles around things, and sometimes she notices things and cannot really name them in a way that an adult could. And then another sort of tactic that I've used in the book is that I've told it from the perspective of an older Hira looking back at her, which sort of allowed me to play with some of the more adult themes, if you will. And so there are certain passages that also dwell on this US exceptionalism, and how because I don't want to give away too much, but 2010, 2011, that time period is particularly chosen because the novel sort of coincides with the death and capture of Osama bin Laden in Pakistan. And so politics with a capital P is never the main point of the book. But of course, Hira is living in this world. She is a Pakistani Muslim who comes to the US at a particular time. And so it's sort of impossible to evade that question at all. And I wanted to explore that question at some level. And so that's one other theme that's discussed in there. And I think that I was going to go through this, but I think a lot of this is already stuff that I've talked about already. The one thing that I will talk about, which I was recently invited to give an address at the Rutgers University, the event that they have at the beginning of I guess the matriculation ceremony. And this was about a group of students who was about to start college. And so I think I was invited to talk about how my book, which was on their reading list, how it might resonate with those students. And I think that I think about that when I also think about how it might resonate with high school students, which is that, again, the most fundamental thing about American Fever is that it is a coming of age story. And I think that if particularly for students who might be towards the latter half of high school, who might already be thinking about colleges and what it means to move away from home, to move away to college, I think that there is a lot in the book that will resonate with them, because it is of course the shift from one country to another, and also, like, again, in Hira's case, from a very specific kind of urban setting to rural United States is far more drastic than what a lot of American students might be doing. But I think that this idea of what it means when you move from a place that's been your cocoon, where you're basically allowed to sort of, let it loose and just be a very, I'm sort of blanking on the word, but where you don't have to really put on a self-presentation, to a place like college, where you are expected to act a certain way. You're on your way to becoming an adult. You are no longer completely unexcused in your behavior and in your postures and in what you say in classes. And so, sort of in preparation for that, the book could be a good tool. The issue of assimilation I've sort of already touched upon, but particularly how it affects immigrants in the US as well as their children, which, as we know, is obviously it's a huge growing group within the country. And then the question of language and US exceptionalism, I think I've already sort of spoken about. And so finally, I think the one other thing that I wanted to say was that if someone does think about or is like considering this book, or if they do not have the space to to basically assign the entire book, there are also, I just wanted to mention a couple of other pieces that I've written that touch upon similar themes, if people are interested in looking those up. One of them is an essay called "Your Tongue is Still Yours" that was published in the Financial Times, which is all about language and multilingualism. If anyone's interested in assigning that to their students. And then the other one that I also mentioned before is the Rutgers Address. It is available online if you just search up the Aziz Amna Rutgers. It's on my newsletter. And I think that is all that I have in terms of this short presentation. I also have there my email address in case anyone wants to reach out with more specific questions.
Great. Thank you so much. That was wonderful. I think from our attendees, if you have questions that you would like us to share, please drop those into the Q&A. This is a lot to take in and think about. So while our audience is adding some questions, I have a couple of questions that I can kind of get us started with, so that we can get this conversation going. First off, I want to say that we do have a little gift box that will be coming your way soon. It'll have your actual award in it, and some Saba, a book award swag that'll be coming soon. So we're just waiting on the final manufacturer of your award. So that'll be coming. Watch your mailbox. It's coming soon.
That's fantastic.
Yeah, something from the committee to our award authors this year. So just you talked a lot about the personal experiences that that you had that informed the writing of the book, and your own time in the US as an exchange student. And I know that Hira had some very intense experiences, those feelings of betrayal, struggles with fitting into a new community, staying true to personal identity and staying connected back home while away, and also kind of reconciling her ambitions as a young person with what she understood others' expectations of her to be. And I think that while they may not be truly universal, these are experiences that all of us go through at roughly that age. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about your inclusion of those experiences. Were you hoping to portray those or include those as a way for non-South Asians or non-Pakistani people to connect to Hira on that sort of basic emotional human level? Or, what was the idea behind that?
Yeah. So, there's something that Chimamanda Adichie, I don't know if people have read her novel Americana, which also, I mean, I don't think it was a template for the book, but I can see a lot of similarities between that and American Fever as well. And One thing that she said about the protagonist in the novel is that she is me if I allowed her to be much angrier. Like, she's a much angrier version of me. And that's sort of how I also think about Hira, where I think one of the complaints that I get, and one of the reasons why the book initially had a hard time in the US market, was that a lot of people found her incredibly unlikable, and just, very off-putting in her many frustrations and bouts of anger and resentment.
Sure.
And I think that that's, I mean, of course, that's fair, and I think that it's always a question of how do you create a character that is very true to life without putting so much pressure on the reader that they sort of lose sympathy with Hira. And of course, it ended up being sort of like on a reader to reader level. There were some people who very much related to her angst and were immediately taken back to their, high school versions. And some people who just couldn't get past that, and that, so you kind of just, go with what you get. But I think that, I think that a lot of her frustrations felt to me like a very natural part of being a person at that age. And then also when you put in those additional pressures of being in a foreign country, completely unmoored, and around a set of cultural norms that seem just extremely absurd to you, even if they, of course, like, if it had been Hira maybe 5 years later, she would have had a different reaction to it. If she'd stayed a few years longer, she would have had a different reaction to them. But in that moment, a lot of that just doesn't make sense to her. And I think that some of it also was, of course, ramping it up for the plot, and to provide a lot of tension for the book. Because the thing with the book is also, it's not a very plotty book. So it's, the move to the US happens, and then there's a twist towards the latter half, which actually is not really a twist because we know about it from the first page, which is that Hira gets extremely sick. But until that sickness manifests, there isn't a lot of huge plotty things going on. So a lot of the drama is internal. A lot of the drama is like her reactions to different things around her.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you for that. So we have a couple of questions that have been submitted by our attendees, and I think this is a good segue actually into this first question is, how has your experience been as a woman of color breaking into the writing industry? And how can other women of color navigate any challenges that you have faced or are currently facing?
Yeah, that's a great question. So it's hard. I think, I mean, it's hard. It is very hard, period. And I think that obviously things are changing, I think hopefully in a good way. But it remains the fact that it is, when you have stories that are, on the margins in any kind of way in US publishing, it is very hard to find space for them. And I don't think that is a problem particular to US publishing. I think that's just sort of like the unfortunate way that things are. It's just very hard to be heard from any kind of margin. For me, it's been also a little confusing because, or not confusing might be the wrong word, because it's hard to sort of delineate what might put you at a disadvantage. So if you were talking from the perspective of, a woman of color, that might be its own challenge. But also if you are speaking from an international or internationalist perspective, that is its own kind of problem, because then you're removing the United States as your center of gravity. And in that, you are inevitably going to lose a certain amount of audience. And so, yeah, I mean, it's hard, but I would also just say that it definitely does feel like a lot of very, very unique and diverse perspectives are continuing to be published more and more. So I'm cautiously optimistic, yes.
I appreciate your cautious optimism. I think I agree. I mean, being from my perspective, working with the Book Award, I think, and Essie and any members of our committee who have joined us today too, would say that, the more loudly we can amplify the voices and the experiences that are being portrayed in the novels like American Fever, the more we all benefit. So, to the extent that you can, please keep writing. There are people out there who want to read what you're contributing to the world. So we thank you for that.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah. So another question from one of our attendees, from Gaurav, do you have any suggestions for higher education researchers trying to bring to light the experiences of South Asian international students?
So does that, I don't know if it's easy enough for them to clarify, but do they mean like literature recommendations for other books that might do that?
That's
Okay.
the way I'm interpreting the question, is additional literature
Got it.
resources, but I will keep an eye on the
Yeah.
chat in case they
Yeah, I mean, I think that there have been, I was actually thinking about this today. I don't know apropos of what, but how there's been this recent influx of tremendous South Asian literature that at least come to my attention that is being published in the US in English. Some of the names that I'm just sort of like listing off my head is one person whose work I absolutely adore is Jamil Jan Kochai. He's Afghan American, and he's written two phenomenal books about set mostly in the Logar province in Afghanistan, but also sort of outside of that. And I want to, the reason why I start off with Jamil is because one thing that I do very strongly feel is that South Asia, of course, like you can sort of spend so much time sort of like talking about what that term means and what it encompasses and what it doesn't. And whether it really is even, a term that means anything. And so you can sort of go on all day about that. But the one thing that I do want to point out is that we do need to think about the margins of whatever this geographical / cultural identity or entity that we've come up with is, and Afghanistan very much lies on those margins, right? And so, but also Jamil, just as a craftsperson and as a writer, is just phenomenal. His recent, he has a book of short stories, The Haunting of Haji Hotak, and a novel called 99 Nights in Logar, and both of them are phenomenal. And actually, because I don't know if the question was specific to the experience of students, right? And one book that I really loved is, it's a little older, is Amitava Kumar's Immigrant Montana. And that very specifically talks about the experience of an Indian student, I believe, who moves here, as is Nishant Injam's The Best Possible Experience. That's a short story collection that came out this year. And Nishant is a friend of mine from Michigan. We both did our MFA together, and his collection of stories also told mostly from the perspective of young Indians moving to the US, or living between the two countries and whatnot, that book is also truly phenomenal.
Wonderful. And do you have, just to kind of build on that same question, you were talking more about particular stories. Do you have experiences? I mean, I know you have particular programs that you've been through, but do you have particular recommendations for programs or writers workshops that you might direct aspiring South Asian writers to apply to?
Yeah. So my experience with writing workshops is somewhat limited. I have two children, 3 and 1, and so for the past 3 years, I have not been able to just do that beautiful thing of taking off for a workshop or a residency. I do know of a few that are, I think Kundiman is one, the Tin House Writers Workshop is another. I mean, it's quite, if you go online or if you start following one of them on a social media channel, you know, you can be in the loop with a lot of the others. And then I think now one thing that is happening that is kind of cool is that there's a certain decentralization that's happening. So a lot of writers will now, there's something called the writing co-op, I believe, that basically lets writers design their own courses and publish them on the website, and then you can just sign up with them, and and with that, what can happen is that you can sort of like look up. I know that I have a friend, Sarah Thuncombe Matthews, whose book All This Could Be Different came out last year, which is also a great book. And I know she conducts courses through those. So it's also becoming easier and easier to, if you are searching specifically for, you know, South Asian tutors who might get your context or the context of your characters at a different level, that is also becoming more and more possible.
That's wonderful to hear. And we'll try to stay in touch with that. So maybe we can make some recommendations and help promote those programs through our website. That would be really great. Yeah. So we have a few more questions that have popped up while you were talking. What other projects are you working on? And can we expect more similarly themed works from you, like American Fever? Or are you working on something completely different right now?
So I am working on something completely different. I think that for me, and I think for a lot of writers, the book that you're working on at the moment is this itch that you're trying to scratch, and then once you've scratched it, it sort of like recedes, at least for a little bit. So I think that I wrote this book that was this story of, you know, a cross-cultural story, and with all these themes of assimilation and immigration, even though Hira is not an immigrant, she's an exchange student and she's a visitor, which I think is also an important distinction that the book tries to draw. But my hope with it was that it sort of moved away from a lot of the tropes that I saw in immigrant fiction. But at the end of the day, it was still the story of this coming to America story. And for my second novel, which is in progress, I just totally wanted to move away from that. So it's set in the 80s and 90s in Pakistan. And it's the story of a woman in her 30s and 40s. And it sort of like tells the story of her marriage, but set with the background of everything that is going on in the country, and a military coup, and then Pakistan's involvement in the war on terror, and all these sort of, you know, things that are happening in the background. But yeah, hopefully very, very different from American Fever. Yeah.
Sounds very different. So another question from one of our audience members is, as a writer, do you feel the need to cater to primarily American and British audiences? And if so, how much does that play into your own writing while maintaining your own authenticity and storytelling?
Yeah. Yeah. I feel like, yeah, I don't know. I feel like I get that question so much that I'm sort of racking my brains for like a new way to answer it. Maybe there isn't a new way to answer it. I think that, well, I think one, that I think it's obviously extremely unfortunate that we keep having to ask this question. And two, it's you know, sort of like a push and pull between recognizing that as an artist, you owe the most to your own work and to your own art and whatever it manifests itself as. Like I was on a panel a couple of days ago, and we were talking about this question of stereotypes, and should you ever mention something that is a stereotype, even if it's true in your fiction, because it might represent the community that might be marginalized in the US improperly. And I mean, I don't know. I feel like I perhaps have a different perspective on it because I was born and raised not here. And so I thankfully maybe do not feel this pressure of representation that might be present for someone who has constantly had to face it in their formative years. But at the same time, the push and pull thing that I was talking about, it remains unfortunately still true that, especially with English publishing, the sort of like centers of power very much still happen to be the US and the UK. And, you know, you can't, if there's, of course, there's budding publishing houses everywhere in the English language world, but it's, there's no question that a lot of the power still radiates from these two sources. And so how do you still make sure that you are, because some of the goal still is obviously, you know, you want as many people as possible to read your book. And yeah, I mean, I think that that's very much attention. I don't know if I like really have the answer yet. But I do think that while there's so much luck involved in all of these things, once if you tell a very good story, at some level it does become universal, even if, you know, outside of all these sort of like petty things of representation and whatnot. I think that there's intelligent, incredible readers everywhere, and again, it takes a lot of luck to be able to get to those readers, but again, another case of, you know, being cautiously optimistic.
Sure. Yeah. Of course. It looks like we've got a few more questions rolling in. But before I get to those, I want to ask, what are your favorite types of stories to read? And I'm not going to ask you favorite authors, but when you reach for things to sort of rejuvenate your creative spirit, what do you go for?
Yeah. I mean, I can tell you my favorite author. I currently, and have at least for a few years now, thought that the greatest living writer we have right now is Elena Ferrante. She, for people who are not familiar with her work, she writes in Italian. Most of her stories are set in her native Naples. And she writes pseudonymously. I don't know how to pronounce that word, but no one knows who she is. That's just her pen name, Elena Ferrante. And the works that I like most from her are obviously the Neapolitan Quartet, which is the story. This also, I guess, it starts off as a coming of age story, but moves to also like their middle age. These two young girls living in Naples that are friends. So it's about friendship, and it's about their marriages, and it's about womanhood. And that's sort of, it was somewhat of a role model for the second book that I'm working on, where she very expertly also brings in the history of Italy and the history of Europe and the post-war changes that were happening on the continent, but so seamlessly that the books are never about, you know, capital P politics and capital H history, but you see all of that in the lives of the two young women.
Thank you for that recommendation. I'm sure that several of us will probably be reaching for that the next time we go to the library or to our favorite local bookstore. So a couple of additional questions then that have rolled in is, would you recommend writing programs like an MFA, such as the one that you did at Michigan, for aspiring writers or poets?
Yes, with the very, very important caveat that you get fully funded to do it. So it's never, ever, 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 unless, I mean, of course, if money's not an issue, then it doesn't matter at all. But as is the case with most of us, if it is, you should never go into debt to go to a writing program, because as they will very explicitly tell you themselves as well, it's not a professional degree. It's a time to get it's you know, 2 or 3 years where you get the time to sit down and work on your novel, or work on your short stories, or work on your memoir, or whatever you have it, and form a community with other writers. So my own experience unfortunately got quite tarnished by just the pandemic and what it did to anyone who was in any kind of educational institution at the time. So I also had a specific experience, but in the absence of that, hopefully it can be a great time to, one, just get the freedom to write, and two, to form this community that can, you know, take you through the inevitable like slew of rejections and just a lot of the sort of challenges that come with being a writer in the current literary landscape.
Yeah, I imagine that. I mean, while there is certainly some loss of community that you experience through, having that cohort through the pandemic time, there's certainly something, I suppose, to be said for that, experience that's unique to your cohort going through that program at that time. So who knows how that might, play out in something that comes through your work in the future, maybe. Who
See,
knows?
now you're being cautiously optimistic.
That's not something I usually do, so I appreciate the compliment. So another question here, do you feel that there's an overarching message or theme, a line, a thread that connects your work?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I'm sure there is. I think that it's so funny though, because my husband, who is the first person who ever reads any of my work, says that everything you write is the same thing. And I think, I mean, maybe that is true. I think I do have a certain fixation with the question of language and the question of multiple languages, and I think that is one thing that that is shown through most of the work that I've written. Just because I am so permanently stamped by having grown up multilingual, and then being in a society where, I mean, again, like hopefully things are changing just as the demographics of the US are shifting. But I think in the US that I arrived in around like 12 years ago, and even now, I think the constant expectation of monolingualism, and what I see sometimes as a complete disregard for the fact that other languages exist, is and that sort of that divide between my own upbringing and what I see around me. Maybe that is one of the reasons, but yeah, language seems to creep into everything that I do, or the question of language. Yeah.
So this is a kind of a good place for us to go next, is why did you decide to become a writer? And I'm going to piggyback on that question and ask if you talked about literary influences. Are there particular teachers or mentors along the way that influenced your writing or lifted you up and helped you find this path?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I think teachers are, I mean, so important, obviously. And I think, again, for people who are listening in here, if there's, I mean, high school teachers particularly are just, because it's such invisible work in certain ways, because by the time that you end up being a certain kind, or end up being an established writer, it's usually like after college, and you've had many more experiences after that, and so it's very hard to get direct credit for someone's achievements 10-20 years down the line. But I have very, very sharp memories of the times where I distinctly remember this one time where I was asking in class that, and this was in Pakistan, I was, I think, like 13 or 14, and I said, can we use the punctuation this way or that way? And I was like sort of fixating about a certain rule, and I remember my English teacher saying to me, Dure, you can do whatever you want, like you are a good enough writer that you can do whatever you want. And this is, of course, like I was writing, I'm sure, like absolute complete juvenilia at the time, but the fact that someone was saying something like that to me has never left me. And so I think teachers are, I mean, incredibly important. Yeah.
So beyond, earlier than that, was there a particular experience that, signaled to you, this is what I'm meant to do? Or was it just a series of experiences as a young writer that prompted you to say, okay, this is what I'm going to make my career out of?
Yeah. Well, to be clear, I still don't know if I'm going to make a career out of it, just because it is so incredibly hard to make a career out of it. But I think that I have always written, and I think part of that was just because I was a reader from as early as I can imagine. And my parents were extremely supportive and encouraging of that. And so it's sort of, but I mean, again, like I know a lot of people who were voracious readers who don't end up being writers, and thank God for them, because we need people to read the books too. So, but so I don't, one thing that I did do, that I also, you know, is great, I think, to encourage in young people, is to, I used to write a lot for those, the magazines that come with the newspapers, the supplements that, you know, the youth supplements, or where kids can send their like letters to the editor, or like short articles and essays and stuff. And I think that from early on, that sort of like gave me this particular high that comes from seeing your work in print and then seeing people respond to it. And I think that was very important. Yeah.
Yeah. We've got time for one last question. There are a couple sitting here, but I think probably a nice big lofty question is a good way to sign off. So is there a particular impact that you hope that your writing has on the readers?
Yeah, wow, that is lofty. I mean, I think it can like sort of differ a lot from book to book. I think that with American Fever, when I wrote it, I very specifically had this idea of writing for the person that I used to be at the time, for writing towards anyone who's felt alone in the world in any kind of way. I don't know if that's necessarily my goal with the second book, because my second book is sort of, it's about a more, you know, it's about an adult, and it's about a different era, and it's about a different circumstance. So yeah, I would say that it does change from project to project.
I would imagine so. And, you know, thinking that you might have different target audience or target specific reader in mind, from project to project. And yeah, who knows where the future may take you, and who knows, you may be back, you know, for another Saba Book Award webinar in the future. So thank you, Dure. This has been amazing. Yeah, and Essie just put in the chat, if there are questions that we didn't have time to answer today, please send those our way. The email address is in the chat, and we will pass those along to Dure, and we'll try to share those back out with you. So thank you all for joining us this afternoon. Dure, thank you so much. And this has really been a pleasure. So thank you.
Yeah, this was such an honor. Thank you everyone for attending, and thank you, Andrea, for hosting.
Absolutely. Thank you, everyone.
All right. Bye.
Bye.